My name is Jonathan, and I'm 43 years old, and until recently, I believed my life was settled. Not perfect. Not exciting. But finished in the way you believe something is finished when you stop asking questions about it. From the outside, my life looked solid. A long marriage, a respectable career, a home filled with routine and predictability. People trusted me, relied on me, saw me as someone who had figured things out. I let them believe that. I let myself believe it too. I wasn't unhappy. That's the part that makes this difficult to explain. There was no betrayal, no explosive arguments, no dramatic moment where everything collapsed at once. There was just a quiet realization, one that took years to form. I had stopped being present in my own life. For a long time, I mistook stability for fulfillment. I told myself that comfort was enough, that wanting more was selfish, that questioning the life I built would mean I was ungrateful for it. So I didn't question it. I adapted. My days followed a predictable rhythm. Wake up early. Coffee. Commute. Meetings that blurred together. Evenings spent discussing logistics rather than feelings. My marriage functioned well. We communicated efficiently. We supported each other practically. We avoided conflict expertly. What we didn't do was connect. Somewhere along the way, intimacy became ceremonial. Something scheduled. Something polite. Something that no longer asked anything of us emotionally. I told myself that this was normal. That this was what long-term commitment looked like. That passion was for younger people or reckless ones. I remember the exact moment I first noticed the silence. It wasn't loud. It was a pause during a conversation where I realized I was nodding without listening. Not because I didn't care, but because I no longer felt involved. I was present physically, absent internally. At work, I was praised for being dependable. At home, I was appreciated for being steady. No one saw what that steadiness was costing me, and I didn't have the language to explain it. The truth is, I had become an observer of my own life. Watching decisions being made on autopilot. Watching years pass without leaving a mark. Watching myself age without evolving. And the most unsettling part? No one noticed because I was performing exactly as expected. I didn't talk about this with anyone. Men aren't encouraged to admit restlessness unless it looks like ambition. We're taught that dissatisfaction means failure or weakness. So I swallowed it. I stayed productive, responsible, quiet. Then something shifted. Not suddenly. Gradually. Almost imperceptibly. It started with exhaustion. Not physical. Existential. A tiredness that sleep didn't touch. I found myself lingering in my car after work, sitting in silence before going inside. Not because I dreaded home, but because I needed a few moments where no one expected anything from me. I began taking longer walks alone, leaving my phone behind, letting my thoughts surface without interruption. At first, they were practical. Then they became uncomfortable. Then they became impossible to ignore. I asked myself questions I had avoided for years. When was the last time I felt alive? When did I last choose something because I wanted it, not because it was logical? Who would I be if no one needed me to stay the same? The answers didn't come immediately, but the questions stayed. I noticed how carefully I curated my reactions, how often I agreed simply to keep things smooth, how rarely I spoke honestly about what I felt. I had become skilled at emotional containment, so skilled that I had contained myself out of existence. My wife and I rarely argued. People envied that. But I realized something unsettling. Conflict requires engagement, and we had disengaged so completely that there was nothing left to fight about. The first crack appeared during an ordinary evening. We were sitting across from each other, discussing plans for the weekend. And suddenly, I felt a wave of sadness so sharp it took my breath away. Not because of her, not because of us, but because I knew with painful clarity that I was no longer choosing this life. I was maintaining it. That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of someone breathing beside me. Someone I cared for deeply, and felt an unfamiliar sense of distance. Not emotional distance from her, distance from myself. I realized I had been loyal to a version of my life that no longer included me, and that realization terrified me more than any thought of change ever had. I didn't act on it. Not yet. Men like me don't act impulsively. We rationalize. We delay. We wait for certainty that never comes. But something had been awakened, and once you see yourself clearly, you can't unsee it. This was the beginning, not of an affair, not of escape, not of destruction, but of awareness. And awareness, I would learn, is the most disruptive force of all. In the next part, I'll tell you about the first conversation I almost had, and why I chose silence instead. Because sometimes the most important turning points are the ones you postpone. And sometimes postponement becomes its own kind of betrayal. There is a strange comfort in postponing the truth. You tell yourself you're being considerate. That silence is protection. That waiting is wisdom. In reality, it's fear wearing a respectable mask. After that sleepless night, nothing visibly changed. I still woke up at the same time. Still went to work. Still kissed my wife on the cheek before leaving. From the outside, I looked exactly the same. Inside, everything felt loosened, as if a single thread had been pulled, and now the entire structure was under quiet strain. I became hyper-aware of my own performance, the tone of my voice, the timing of my responses, the way I smiled at appropriate moments. It wasn't new. I had been doing this for years, but now I could see it. And once you see yourself acting, it becomes exhausting to keep going. At work, I found it harder to concentrate, not because the tasks were difficult, but because they felt oddly irrelevant. I would sit in meetings, listening to discussions about projections and deadlines, and feel a growing sense of detachment, as if I were watching a life that belonged to someone else. During lunch breaks, I stopped scrolling on my phone. Instead, I watched people. Strangers walking past the cafe window. A man laughing too loudly, a woman arguing on the phone, a couple holding hands without realizing anyone could see them. I wondered what they were choosing, and what they were merely continuing. At home, the silence between my wife and me grew more noticeable. Not heavier, just clearer. We talked, of course, about groceries, about schedules, about things that needed fixing. But there was an invisible line neither of us crossed. We didn't ask each other how we felt. And I realized something uncomfortable. I didn't know how to answer that question anymore. I tried to remember when we stopped sharing ourselves. There was no single moment, no argument, no betrayal, just a slow replacement of curiosity with assumption. We thought we already knew each other, so we stopped checking. One evening, she asked me if everything was okay. Her tone was casual, almost automatic. I said yes. The word came out easily, too easily. And in that moment, I understood how practiced my dishonesty had become. Not malicious, not intentional, just habitual. That night, I went for a walk after dinner. The air was cool, the streets familiar. I passed houses where lights glowed behind curtains, each window holding a version of domestic life. I wondered how many of those homes were filled with unspoken questions. How many people were living parallel lives with their own thoughts. I realized I had spent decades being reliable, responsible, predictable, and that identity had slowly consumed everything else. There was no room left for desire, or doubt, or reinvention. I didn't resent my wife. That surprised me. My dissatisfaction wasn't directed at her. It was inward. She had built her life around the version of me I had presented. I had done the same. We were both victims of a story we stopped revising. I started journaling. First, it felt absurd. A middle-aged man writing thoughts he didn't even know how to articulate. But the pages filled quickly. Not with answers, with questions. Questions I had been avoiding since my 30s. What would it mean to want something different now? Who would I disappoint if I changed? Who had I already disappointed by staying the same? The more I wrote, the more I understood something crucial. I wasn't afraid of losing my life. I was afraid of choosing it and discovering it no longer fit. There was a morning when I looked at myself in the mirror and felt a strange mix of recognition and distance. I saw a man who had done everything right. And yet, I couldn't remember the last decision I made purely because it felt true. Not reasonable. Not expected. True. I considered talking to my wife. Rehearsed the conversation in my head. Every version ended the same way. With her hurt. With confusion. With me unable to explain what exactly was wrong. How do you tell someone you love that nothing is broken, but you still feel lost? So I stayed quiet. I convinced myself I needed clarity before speaking. But clarity never comes in isolation. It comes from risk. And I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I began noticing moments that unsettled me. A conversation with a colleague that felt unexpectedly honest. A book passage that lingered longer than it should have. A memory from my 20s that resurfaced without warning. Fragments of a self I had archived long ago. I wasn't tempted to run away. I wasn't planning an escape. What frightened me was something subtler. The idea that my life could continue exactly like this, uninterrupted, for another 20 years. And that no one would ever know I had questioned it. The silence grew heavier. Not because it was loud, but because it was deliberate. Every day I didn't speak became a choice. And every choice carried weight. By the end of that month, I knew one thing with certainty. I couldn't go back to not knowing. Awareness had changed the rules, even if nothing else had changed yet. In the next part, I'll tell you about the moment someone noticed, and how a single, unexpected question began to unravel everything I thought I was protecting. Because sometimes, it isn't the people closest to us who see the truth first. It's the ones who have nothing to lose by asking. There is a moment when silence stops being neutral, turns from shelter into pressure. And once that happens, every quiet second begins to demand payment. The question came from someone I didn't expect. Not my wife. Not a friend. Not even myself. Came from a man I barely knew. His name was Thomas. We worked on different floors, crossed paths occasionally near the coffee machine. He was polite in an unremarkable way, the kind of person you remember only by routine. One morning, the elevator stalled between floors. Not dramatically, just long enough to disrupt the rhythm of the day. We stood there in silence at first, phones in hand, eyes avoiding each other. Then Thomas sighed, not frustrated, tired. The sound carried something heavier than inconvenience. He looked at me and said, casually, almost absent-mindedly, "Do you ever feel like your life is happening without your consent?" The question landed harder than anything I had heard in years. I laughed, automatically, a defensive reflex, but he didn't smile back. He just waited. The elevator hummed softly. Seconds passed. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not panic, but recognition. And before I could stop myself, I said, "Yes." The word surprised both of us. Surprised me more, because I hadn't rehearsed it. I hadn't softened it. Came out raw. Honest. Thomas nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he already suspected. "Me too," he said. Most days. The elevator started moving again. The doors opened. We stepped out. And yet, neither of us moved toward our offices. We stood there, awkwardly suspended between obligation and something unnamed. Then Thomas spoke again. "I'm getting divorced," he said. "Not because I don't love her, but because I realized I didn't recognize myself anymore." There it was. A confession offered without drama, without justification, just truth. I felt an urge to retreat, to return to my safe, curated life. But another part of me, the part one had been ignoring, leaned forward. "Was it worth it?" I asked. Thomas considered the question carefully. "I don't know yet," he said. "But it was necessary. Necessary." The word echoed long after we went our separate ways. That evening I couldn't focus. Not on work. Not on conversation. My thoughts kept circling the same realization. Someone had seen me. Not fully. Not intimately. But enough. Enough to ask the right question. I replayed the moment again and again. Not because of what Thomas said, but because of how easily I answered. That night, I told my wife I was tired and went to bed early. In reality, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning every assumption I had built my life on. Was stability always the highest virtue? Or had I mistaken fear for responsibility? I thought about the promises I had made, some aloud, some silently, promises to be dependable, to be consistent, to not disrupt the lives of others. But when had I promised myself anything? The next morning, my wife noticed my distraction. "You've been distant lately," she said gently, not accusing, just observing. I wanted to tell her everything, about the journal, about the elevator, about the growing sense that my life had been placed on pause without my permission. But fear intervened. Fear of causing pain. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of discovering that honesty wouldn't fix anything. "I'm just tired," I said, the safest lie. She nodded, though her eyes lingered on me a second longer than usual. I could tell she sensed something was off, but she respected the boundary I had drawn, even if she didn't know why it was there. At work, I began to notice Thomas more. Not deliberately, but once someone cracks open a truth, they become impossible to ignore. We didn't talk about the elevator again, but our interactions changed. There was less pretense, more pauses, more silence that didn't feel empty. One afternoon, he asked if I wanted to get coffee. Not as colleagues, as people. We sat across from each other in a small cafe, the noise around us forming a protective barrier. He told me about his marriage. Not the details, the erosion. The way small compromises had accumulated. The way avoidance had masqueraded as peace. "I didn't leave because I wanted something else," he said. "I left because I didn't want to disappear." The sentence lodged itself deep inside me. Disappear. That was the word. I realized how often I had chosen invisibility. How often I had muted myself to keep the structure intact. How often I had avoided conflict by erasing my own needs. When I got home that evening, my wife was cooking. The familiar sounds filled the kitchen. The scent of dinner. The rhythm of shared routine. I watched her from the doorway, and for the first time in a long while, I felt both love and distance simultaneously. Not contradiction. Duality. I wondered if she felt it too. If she had her own unspoken questions. If we were both waiting for the other to break the silence. Later that night, I opened my journal again. This time, I didn't write questions. I wrote a statement. "I am afraid to speak because I don't know who I'll become once I do." That realization terrified me, because it meant silence was no longer passive. It was active participation in my own erasure. I began to understand that truth doesn't demand readiness. It demands courage, and courage often arrives before clarity. A few days later, my wife asked me something unexpected. "Do you ever feel lonely?" she said. Her voice was calm, but there was vulnerability beneath it. The room felt suddenly smaller, the moment heavier. I knew this was a threshold. I could retreat, deflect, maintain the illusion. Instead, I hesitated, and in that hesitation, she saw everything. "I think we both do," I said quietly. She didn't respond right away. She looked at me, really looked, as if seeing me through a lens she hadn't used in years. "We should talk," she said finally. Not urgently, not angrily, just honestly. That night, we didn't resolve anything. We didn't make decisions. We didn't rewrite our lives. But we acknowledged the crack. And once acknowledged, it could no longer be ignored. I went to bed knowing one thing. The silence that had protected us was gone. And whatever came next, truth, pain, change, would require more from me than avoidance ever had. In the next part, I'll tell you about the conversation that forced me to confront the difference between loving someone and being honest with them. Because sometimes the most dangerous lie is the one told in the name of peace. There is a specific kind of fear that doesn't scream. It whispers. It waits. And it becomes most powerful when you start telling yourself you still have time. We sat at the kitchen table long after the dishes were cleared. No phones. No television. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the space where words should have been. My wife folded her hands together, then unfolded them. A nervous habit I had seen for years but never truly noticed. "Say it," she said softly. "Whatever it is you're holding back." The invitation felt heavier than an accusation, because it meant she already knew something was wrong, and she was choosing honesty over comfort. I took a breath, then another, and realized neither would be enough. I don't feel present in my own life anymore, I said. The sentence came out steadier than I expected, as if it had been waiting its turn. She didn't interrupt, didn't defend, didn't correct me. She just listened, and that somehow made it harder. I go through the motions, I continued. I show up, I do what's expected, I take care of what needs to be done. But inside, it feels like I've been watching myself from a distance. Her eyes softened, not with relief, but recognition. That's how I feel too, she said. The admission knocked the air out of me. Not because I suspected otherwise, but because hearing it confirmed something I had been afraid to acknowledge. How long? I asked. She thought for a moment. Longer than I want to admit, she said. Shorter than you probably think. We sat with that. Two people finally admitting the same loneliness from opposite sides of the same table. I kept telling myself it was normal, she continued. That this is what long-term love looks like. That stability replaces excitement. That quiet means safe. And does it? I asked. She hesitated, then shook her head slowly. No, she said. It just means quiet. The honesty stung, because it stripped away the narrative I had built to protect us. I never wanted to hurt you, I said. That's why I stayed silent. She looked at me then, not angrily, not sadly, but with a kind of tired clarity. Silence hurts too, she said. It just takes longer to notice. That sentence would echo in my head for weeks. We talked for hours, not about blame, not about fault, but about erosion. The kind that happens when two people choose avoidance over curiosity. She told me about moments she had swallowed her needs to keep the peace. Times she felt unseen but told herself it wasn't worth bringing up. How she slowly stopped asking questions because she was afraid of the answers. I told her about the journal, about the questions, about the sense of disappearing. She didn't ask to read it. She didn't need to. The truth was already between us. At some point, she asked the question I had been dreading. Do you still want this life? She said. Not us. This life. The distinction mattered. It separated obligation from desire. I don't know, I said, and for the first time that answer felt honest instead of evasive. She nodded. I don't know either, she said. There was no explosion, no tears, just the quiet acknowledgement that uncertainty had finally been allowed into the room. That night, we slept on opposite sides of the bed. Not as punishment, as space. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every word. Not searching for regret, searching for truth. The next days were strange. We were kinder to each other, more attentive, but also more distant, as if we were both afraid that touching too tightly might break something fragile. At work, Thomas noticed the change immediately. You look lighter, he said one afternoon. I feel exposed, I replied. He smiled knowingly. Same thing, he said. I started paying attention to how often people around me were pretending, smiling automatically, nodding without listening, living lives that looked functional but felt hollow. I wondered how many of us were waiting for permission to tell the truth, and how few ever received it. One evening, my wife suggested a walk. No destination, just movement. We walked side by side, not holding hands. The city around us continued as usual, unaware that something fundamental was shifting inside two ordinary people. I don't want to rush into decisions, she said. But I also don't want to go back to pretending. Neither do I said. That was the first agreement we had reached in years. We decided to give ourselves time, not to fix things, but to observe them honestly. That meant uncomfortable conversations. It meant resisting the urge to smooth things over. It meant allowing silence to exist without filling it with excuses. Some days were hopeful, others were heavy, but none were numb. And that, I realized, was the real change. I wasn't disappearing anymore. I was becoming visible. even if I didn't yet know who that version of me would be. In the next part, I'll tell you about the moment when honesty stopped being internal and became something we had to act on. Because understanding the truth is one thing. Living it is another entirely. People talk about truth as if it's a moment. A confession, a sentence, a single brave act. They rarely talk about what happens after. Because once the truth is spoken, it doesn't disappear. It demands space, time, consequences. The agreement we made to observe honestly sounded simple. It wasn't. Honesty turned everyday moments into mirrors. And mirrors don't lie. We noticed things we had trained ourselves not to see. How conversations ended too quickly. How touch had become polite instead of instinctive. How silence no longer felt peaceful, just unfinished. Some mornings I woke up feeling clear. Other mornings, I felt like I had cracked open something I didn't know how to put back together. One afternoon I came home early. The apartment was quiet. My wife's shoes were by the door, but she wasn't in the living room. I heard the shower running. I stood there longer than necessary, listening, thinking, wondering when shared space had started feeling borrowed. That night we talked again. Not dramatically, just honestly. I keep asking myself what I'd choose if I wasn't afraid, she said. And, I asked. She looked down. That's the problem, she said. I don't know if I'm afraid of leaving or afraid of staying. Her words landed harder than anger ever could, because they mirrored my own thoughts too perfectly. I'm scared I'll regret whatever choice I make, I admitted. She smiled sadly. That means we're human, she said. The days that followed felt suspended. Neither of us made plans far into the future. Neither of us spoke about forever. We existed in the present with a new kind of attention. At work, my focus shifted. I stopped pretending to care about things that didn't matter. I started asking myself why I had accepted a life that felt smaller than my capacity. One evening, Thomas asked me a question I hadn't expected. If nothing changed, he said, could you live like this for the next 10 years? The answer came instantly. No. That scared me, because clarity removes excuses. That night, I told my wife what Thomas had asked, and what my answer had been. She didn't react immediately. She walked to the window, stared outside, let the city lights reflect in the glass. I asked myself something similar, she said quietly. And, she turned to face me. I don't think either of us deserves a life we're just surviving, she said. That sentence stayed with me, because it wasn't about love ending. It was about self-respect beginning. We decided to see a counselor, not to save the marriage, but to understand it. The sessions were uncomfortable. There was no villain, no betrayal, just two people who had grown carefully apart. The counselor asked us to describe the moment we first felt unseen. We answered separately. Our answers were almost identical. Different dates. Same feeling. That realization hurt more than disagreement ever had. Between sessions, I began writing again. Not questions this time. Statements. Things I had avoided admitting. I am afraid of wasting my life. I confuse stability with fulfillment. I stayed because leaving felt selfish. I don't know who I am outside of responsibility. Each sentence felt like a small release, and a small grief. One night, my wife asked to read what I had written. I hesitated, then handed her the notebook. She read slowly, carefully, as if each line carried weight. When she finished, she closed it gently. You've been lonely for a long time, she said. So have you, I replied. She nodded. Yes, she said. But I didn't know how to say it without destroying everything. That was when I understood something crucial. Silence isn't the absence of care. It's often the presence of fear. A week later, we took a weekend apart. Not as a break, as perspective. I stayed in a small rental outside the city. No distractions. No schedule. Just time. The first night, I slept poorly. My mind replayed memories. Not the worst ones. The ordinary ones. The routines. The predictability. I realized how much of my identity was built around being dependable, and how little space I had left for being alive. On the second day, I went for a long walk. No destination, just movement. I asked myself what kind of man I wanted to be if no one was watching. The answer surprised me. I wanted to be honest. Not impressive. Not admired. Just honest. That evening, my wife called. Her voice sounded different. Calmer. Clearer. "I think we've been trying to save something that already changed," she said. "I think you're right," I replied. There was no panic. No urgency. Just recognition. We agreed to talk when I returned. Not about logistics. About truth. When I came back, we sat where we always did. At the kitchen table. The place where everything important seemed to happen. "I love you," she said. "And I don't think love is the problem." I nodded. "Neither do I said. We held hands. Not desperately. Not nostalgically. But gratefully. Because sometimes love doesn't end in anger. Sometimes it ends in understanding. In the next part, I'll tell you about the decision we made, and the moment I realized that choosing honesty meant letting go of the life I had carefully built. Even when I wasn't sure what would replace it. If you're ready, we keep going. People imagine endings as explosions. Raised voices. Slamming doors. Irreversible damage. But some endings arrive quietly. They sit down across from you. They hold your hand. And they ask you to be honest one last time. We didn't decide everything that night. We didn't need to. The truth had already chosen for us. We talked for hours, but the conversation felt different from before. There was no convincing, no bargaining, no trying to rescue a version of ourselves that no longer existed. "I don't want to wake up in 10 years and realize we stayed because it was easier," she said. "I don't want to leave and later realize I was just afraid of being uncomfortable," I replied. We looked at each other and smiled. A real smile. Not because it was happy, because it was honest. The decision didn't come as a dramatic declaration. Came as a shared understanding. We were going to separate. Not immediately, not angrily, but intentionally. That word mattered. We agreed to take time, to plan carefully, to treat the ending with the same respect we once treated the beginning. The following weeks were surreal. We still lived together, still shared meals, still laughed occasionally, but everything felt temporary, like packing without boxes. I started noticing the apartment differently. Which mugs were hers? Which habits were mine? How many routines we had built together without realizing it. Each detail felt heavier now that it had an expiration date. Friends noticed the change. "You seem different," one said. "More present," another added. They didn't know the cost of that presence. At night, when the apartment was quiet, doubt crept in. What if I was making a mistake? What if this was just a phase? What if stability really was enough? But then I imagined staying. And the doubt shifted. I imagined waking up years later with the same unanswered questions. The same quiet dissatisfaction. The same sense of shrinking. That image scared me more than leaving ever could. One evening, we sorted through old photos. Trips. Birthdays. Moments that proved our love had been real. "I don't regret us," she said softly. "Neither do I replied. "And that makes this harder." We cried that night. Not from heartbreak. From gratitude. And grief. Because losing something meaningful hurts even when it's the right choice. The counselor asked us a final question in our last session. "What are you afraid of now?" She answered first. "I'm afraid of rediscovering myself and realizing how much I compromised," she said. I nodded. "I'm afraid of finding freedom and not knowing what to do with it," I said. The counselor smiled gently. "Those are honest fears," she said. "And honesty is a good place to start." We told our families next. That was harder. Not because they didn't support us, but because they didn't understand. "You seemed fine," my mother said. "We were," I replied. And that was part of the problem. Explaining emotional truth to people who value appearances felt impossible. So I stopped trying. The day she moved out arrived quietly. No ceremony. No audience. Just boxes. And memories. We hugged at the door. Longer than expected. Shorter than needed. Take care of yourself, she said. I will, I replied. You too. The door closed, and suddenly the apartment felt enormous. The silence wasn't empty. It was loud. The first nights alone were brutal. I slept poorly, ate randomly, forgot simple things. Freedom, I learned, isn't comforting at first. It's disorienting. I caught myself reaching for my phone to tell her something small. A funny observation, a random thought. Each time I stopped and felt the weight of that absence. But slowly something else emerged. Space. I rearranged the furniture, changed routines, started running in the mornings. Not to improve myself, just to feel my body moving forward. I began saying no to things I didn't want. Yes to things I had avoided. One afternoon, I realized I hadn't checked the time all day. I had been fully inside my life. That scared me and thrilled me. Thomas noticed. You're not hiding anymore, he said. I didn't know I was, I replied. That's usually how it works, he said. There were lonely moments, plenty of them, but loneliness felt different now. It wasn't a cage. It was a signal. I started asking myself new questions. Not what should I do, but what feels true. Some answers were inconvenient. Others were liberating. One night, I sat alone on the floor with my journal. I wrote a sentence that would change everything. I am responsible for my own life. No exceptions. No excuses. That realization didn't make things easier. It made them real. And reality, I learned, is the foundation of any meaningful future. In the next part, I'll tell you about the moment I fully stepped into that responsibility and the unexpected consequence of choosing myself for the first time. Because freedom isn't just about leaving. It's about what you're brave enough to build afterward. When you're ready, we go to the final chapter. Freedom doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with mornings that feel unfamiliar, with silence that asks questions instead of giving answers, with the unsettling realization that no one else is responsible anymore. The first months alone blurred together, not because nothing happened, but because everything did. I learned how much of my life had been structured around someone else's presence. Meals, sleep, even the way I spoke to myself. Without that structure, I felt exposed, like a house without furniture, still standing, but echoing. People asked how I was doing. I gave honest answers. I'm learning, I said. I'm uncomfortable, I said. I'm okay, I said when I was. Some days were heavy. Others felt unexpectedly light. I stopped measuring my progress. Stopped asking whether I was over it. Started asking whether I was present. One afternoon, months after the separation, I ran into my ex-wife by chance. A grocery store, a narrow aisle, no warning. For a second, time folded in on itself. Then it passed. We smiled. Not politely, genuinely. How are you? She asked. Different, I replied. And you? Me too, she said. There was no ache, no longing, just warmth and respect. We talked for a few minutes. Nothing deep, nothing necessary. Then went our separate ways. As I walked out, I realized something quietly profound. The past no longer pulled me backward. It stood behind me, complete. That night, I sat with that realization and felt something close to peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the absence of regret. I thought about the man I had been when this story began. The one who stayed silent. The one who confused endurance with virtue. The one who thought disappearing was safer than choosing. I understood him now. I didn't judge him. He did the best he could with the awareness he had. But I wasn't him anymore. I had learned that honesty isn't loud. It's consistent. It shows up daily, in small choices, in uncomfortable truths. I started dating again, slowly, not to fill space, but to explore connection without pretending. Some connections faded quickly. Others lingered briefly. None felt like failure. For the first time, I wasn't trying to make something last. I was trying to make something real. I also spent time alone. A lot of it. Not avoiding people, but getting to know myself without distraction. I discovered preferences I'd buried, opinions I'd softened, boundaries I'd never articulated. Responsibility stopped feeling like a burden, felt like ownership. One evening, I reread the old journal, the questions that had started everything. What am I avoiding? What am I afraid to admit? What would honesty cost me? I smiled, because I finally knew the answers. Honesty had cost me a life that looked right, and given me one that felt true. I thought about how many people are living quiet versions of their own disappearance. How many are waiting for a moment dramatic enough to justify change? There usually isn't one, just a slow accumulation of awareness. If the story sounds familiar, I won't tell you what to do. That's not the point. But I will say this: pay attention to the places where you go quiet inside yourself. Those are the places asking to be heard. Choosing yourself doesn't always mean leaving someone else. Sometimes it means finally arriving. I don't know what my future looks like, and for the first time that doesn't scare me, because I'm here, fully, honestly, and that is enough. This was my confession. Thank you for listening.